Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History magazine. Has Britain always been a nation of animal lovers? Well, according to Professor Helen Cowie of the University of York, the answer to that question is no. To mark 200 years since the founding of the RSPCA, David Musgrove spoke to Helen about Victorian legislation and campaigning that sought to prevent cruelty to animals back during the organisation's early days, and how attitudes to animals have changed since then. He began by asking when society first started to agitate for the protection of animals against mistreatment.
I suppose it starts in the Georgian era, so the late 18th century, and historians tend to attribute it to a mix of both, I guess, new ideas, changing attitudes, and also changing social conditions. So on the one hand, you start to see in the late 18th century a sort of gradual shift in perceptions of animals. And this grows in part from, I suppose, new religious principles, particularly coming from sort of nonconformist groups like Quakers and Methodists. And they increasingly stress that it's man's duty to actually care for God's creation, not just to kind of exploit it and use it. At the same time, there's a more sort of secular emphasis on essentially the ideas that animals can feel pain. For that reason, they're deserving of moral consideration. This is perhaps best articulated by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who claims that when we're thinking about, why should animals be treated with compassion and which animals, the question isn't, can they reason? It isn't can they talk, but it's can they suffer? So that starts to become quite significant. At the same time, you start to see sort of social changes, and the key ones here in Britain are urbanisation and industrialisation. So urbanisation means that often more sort of middle-class people are closer to animals than perhaps they'd been before. They witness cruelty on the streets, they become more sensitised towards it, and they call for change. Industrialisation also changes more sort of traditional human-animal relations, and this particularly affects kind of old pastimes like bull baiting and bear baiting, which could go on for a really long time. And that wasn't acceptable once you start to get people working in factories, kind of working at the pace of the machine. If you're a factory owner, you don't want your workers going out and watching a bull bait all day. So from a more sort of utilitarian perspective as well, there's a desire to kind of control people socially, which impacts on how they interact with animals. So this is kind of confluence of different things coming about in the early 19th century.
Well, that's really interesting. So as you would expect, it's all tied in with the broader changes that are going on. And that point about sort of factory hours is very interesting. You wouldn't imagine that would have any bearing on animal attitudes.
No, you wouldn't think so, but actually it shapes them. And I suppose it shapes more sort of moral attitudes towards the working class as well, which we'll probably cover a little bit more detail later on. But how people treat animals is often connected with how they treat other people, how they behave socially. And certainly a sort of new breed of moral reformers are very kind of worried about that and want to ensure that the lower classes are behaving themselves. And they kind of see the treatment of animals as sort of a marker of civilization as well. So all of these things get kind of interconnected.
Are we talking specifically about Britain here? I guess your research focuses mostly on that, but is Britain particularly prominent in the movement?
Yes, it is. And that's largely because it industrialises and urbanises before most other countries. It is not because British people have some sort of innate love of animals and have always been kind to them. So obviously we like to have that image of ourselves today, or we're a nation of animal lovers. I don't buy that as an argument, and historians, particularly Harriet Ritvo, have shown that that's just not true. English people were really unkind to animals. They were baiting them, they were beating them. A really well-known image of this is William Hogarth's 4 Stages of Cruelty, which he published as a series of engravings in 1751. And these all show people treating animals abysmally, beating horses to make them move, mistreating dogs and cats. So the British were not great when it came to the treatment of animals. But with these new conditions coming in, people do start to change their mind. And then because Britain is an imperial power, it's also able to kind of export some of these ideas overseas to places like India and Australia. So it is prominent, but it's not because British people naturally loved animals or treated them well.
Okay. So that was going to be one of my closing questions, which you've answered now, but let me just dive into it a bit more. So this idea that we sort of hold tight in Britain, that we are a nation of animal lovers and always have been, you would contend that that's misplaced?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's evidence for that. There've always been individual people who felt close to their animals and cared for them, particularly in the context of pets, although they become a much more common phenomenon in the 19th century and onwards. But there's also been a big strand of cruelty, whether working animals that are eaten. Like I said, Britain is no better than any other countries at that period.
Okay. All right. So as you said, the sort of the conditions, the economic and social conditions aligned during the Victorian period to make people think more closely about animal cruelty and animal suffering. When was legislation in Britain introduced to protect animals against suffering? Who brought it in and how was it received?
So you get sort of more local bits of legislation against kind of particular acts of cruelty to animals from sort of the early 18th century. There's a particularly grim sport, which is called cock throwing, where you kind of throw missiles at a tethered bird until it dies, which is deemed really unsporting as well as being very cruel. So lots of local kind of places actually banned that quite early on. And bull baiting as well gets banned in some places. In Birmingham, for example, bull baiting is banned in 1773. But none of that is nationwide.
What exactly is bull baiting?
So typically it entails you get a bull, which is usually a pretty ferocious animal, and you get several dogs. Often people would bring their own dogs that were kind of specially trained for this. You would set the dogs on the bull. What the dogs are trying to do is to kind of grasp their teeth onto the kind of lower lip of the bull. And these are dogs, well, they're called bulldogs, and they were particularly bred for this. They don't look anything like contemporary bulldogs, which have been bred, to have very different features. So they would grab the bull on its lower lip. The bull, conversely, would try to sort of throw the dogs off. So you often see images of bull baiting with dogs kind of hanging in midair because the bull has sort of tossed them off or perched on the bull's horn. It's pretty grim. Have pretty grisly accounts of this, both in terms of what happens to the bull and in terms of what happens to the dogs as well.
Yeah, that sounds extremely savage and unpleasant. Thank you for that. So sorry, back to where you were. So you're saying that locally legislation was in place.
Yeah, absolutely, but not nationally. And the first attempts to introduce that come in 1800. So an MP called William Pulteney introduces a bill to ban bull and bear baiting and other kinds of animal fighting. This doesn't go anywhere. It meets opposition in Parliament and is voted down. There's a second attempt then in 1802. Another MP brings in the same bill, again gets thrown out. This then becomes quite a familiar pattern. So in 1809, John Erskine tries to bring in a bill which is a bit broader in this case. This is about not just bull and bear baiting, but about protecting livestock in particular and kind of working animals. Again, that doesn't work. It gets voted down, and we can think a bit about why that happens. But ultimately, in 1822, an MP called Richard Martin, who is the MP for Galway and a bit of a character, he introduces a bill to ban, in this case, actually not animal fighting, but mistreatment of animals in public places. So again, particularly livestock and cattle that were being driven through the streets. And this ultimately does get through Parliament and it becomes law in 1822. So this is the first bit of animal cruelty legislation anywhere globally. So it's very significant, but it took a long time to happen.
You invited us just then to consider what were the vested interests and reservations about this early legislation. So what were the concerns put forward by parliamentarians?
One is the issue that actually we still see when animal welfare legislation gets put before Parliament, which is the idea that it's kind of a bit insignificant. It's a waste of parliamentary time to be talking about animals when there are all these sort of human problems going on. There's also a sense, particularly in this period, that this is going to involve effectively the state interfering with people's lives. So this is more of a libertarian argument that the state shouldn't be kind of legislating for these sort of small customs. People shouldn't be allowed to make their own decision. One MP called William Wyndon very effectively kind of articulates this view, and he's a big reason that the legislation doesn't get through. The other reason that it doesn't get through, and I think this is actually a more legitimate concern, is that a lot of this early legislation is really targeted at the lower classes. So things like bull and bear baiting, you do get members of the elite involved in it, but it's seen as a working class pursuit. So there's this kind of fear that you're attacking lower class pleasures. There's partly a fear that if they're not engaging at bull baiting, they're going to be having a revolution, and people look to France and worry about that. but also the sense that it's unfair. So that when they're trying to reintroduce legislation to prevent bull baiting in 1826, the Home Secretary Robert Peel explicitly says it's really unfair that a magistrate who might have spent all day going out, fox hunting and dining on cod, which he's killed perhaps himself, he can then sentence another man to a fine or imprisonment because he's baited a bull. So there's this sense that you're not attacking the sports of the rich, and things like fox hunting are not attacked in this period and actually for a very long time. But you are kind of focusing on sort of the little man. And some of this is true. So there are these kind of inherent injustices within it which generate opposition.
And I suppose this is the period, or we're moving into the period when sort of sports are being formalised as well, which maybe sort of is part of the same sort of conversations.
I think so. I mean, certainly sort of later in the 19th century, I am in no way an expert on football and its history, but you do start to see that being seen as a sort of a sport for the masses. And also a good way for the masses to kind of let out their energy in a wholesome fashion. And you also get more kind of archaic commentary on people saying, why don't we bring back archery and the quarterstaff? And, kind of, I guess, a sort of medieval romantic view of what the working class ought to be doing versus what they are doing. So, yeah, all of that is kind of feeding into this.
When do we see the formation of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals?
So that happens in 1824, so a couple of years after the first animal cruelty legislation. And the purpose of it is to enforce that effectively. So you could have the legislation on the statute books, but if no one's there to actually, survey what's going on, to actually prosecute, nothing's going to happen. So that's the purpose of the society, and it happens in 1824.
So this is the bicentenary. When does it become the Royal Society?
Not until 1840, and that's because at that point Queen Victoria sort of becomes the patron and grants them the ability to call themselves royal. So it's just SPCA before then.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit more about what the SPCA and then latterly the RSPCA was doing? How was it trying to assist in the enforcement of this legislation?
So they have, I guess, sort of three key tactics that they use. So one is all about policing effectively. So they appoint sort of constables, sort of later inspectors, not many in issue, so there's just a couple for the first sort of decade or so. But then this increases to you've got sort of nearly 100 towards the end of the 19th century. And these would be people who would kind of go out on the streets. They sort of had a beat to patrol, a bit like, the ordinary police were also being kind of formed in this period. And if they see someone beating a horse, mistreating a dog, they would probably speak to them. And if they didn't get sort of a satisfactory response, they would then threaten to prosecute them. So you start to see people being brought before magistrates and usually fined, sometimes imprisoned if they can't pay the fine, which is another reason this is a bit of a classist bit of legislation. So enforcement is really important. They also rely on kind of denunciation from members of the public who might spot something but not want to intervene, but they can report it to the RSPCA, who will do something about it. Alongside that, they also lobby to change the law. So not all animals are covered by the initial cruelty legislation. So like initially it doesn't even cover bull and bear baiting, not until 1835. And after that, it only covers domestic animals. So they spend quite a bit of time sometimes bringing test cases to see whether a particular animal is or isn't covered by the law. So in the 1870s, they're quite worried about performing animals, but these are not domestic animals, which are the only ones covered officially. So they'll kind of bring a case to see, is a hyena a domestic animal? And if not, they will then lobby Parliament to kind of change the law. So that's the kind of second strand of what they're doing. And the third way that they tried to change things is, I guess, more subtly by education and trying to actually change attitudes. And this becomes, again, more prominent in the late 19th century. But they do things like circulating pamphlets about particularly cruel types of abuse of animals. They try to send information to children, so they get them to write essays in special competitions about how can we treat animals well. And in 1869, they have their own magazine called The Animal World, which is published every month. And this contains all kinds of stories about animals, images, engravings, later photographs, but also information on sort of current campaigns and the latest prosecutions. So they have a kind of range of things that they're trying to do.
I imagine that hyenas weren't designated as domestic animals.
They were not, but you actually have quite arcane discussions about whether they should be, particularly if an animal's kind of dependent on humans, say, for its food, as captive hyenas were. So these were in a menagerie rather than, wild, obviously. So that argument is put forward, but no, the judge ultimately says no, they're not.
Yeah, I'm not aware of a large extant wild population of hyenas in Britain.
No.
But as you say, they were part and parcel of the travelling menagerie. So I wonder, what was the response? In people obviously loved travelling menageries and circuses. That was a really big form of entertainment. What did people think about the way that animals were treated in these menageries?
I think you see increasing concern as the century progresses. Like many people don't care. I mean, attitudes towards animals and awareness just of what these wild animals would have required in terms of space and diet were just not where they are today. So there was a lot of indifference. There were a lot of people who liked to go to a menagerie, and poke a tiger or mistreat an animal in various ways. Someone actually goes round a menagerie, I think it's in Ireland, and squirts vinegar into the lion's eye or something very grim. So there's a grim set of people who wouldn't have cared. On the other hand, though, particularly as you get towards sort of the 1860s and 70s, there is growing concern about some forms of treatment towards some animals. And in the case of the hyenas, for example, the RSPCA claims that these hyenas were made to perform in an arena. They had to kind of jump through burning hoops. A lot of them got burnt as a result. So it was pretty nasty. But the RSPCA actually claims that people in the crowd were crying shame when this was happening and not supporting it. And there's a similar example of an elephant that was made to go down a water chute when it didn't want to. And apparently people were hissing and booing when this happened. So there was some public dislike for that. I wouldn't say that was in any way universal, but there was some support for effectively stopping these more, I guess, flagrant forms of cruelty. Not stopping menageries, people were happy to see them, but saying, but we shouldn't have this taming, for example.
Yeah, okay. And so different species of animals attracted different levels of attention. I imagine that sort of dogs and cats you would expect would be the ones that people were most worried about cruelty to, or is that just a modern affectation?
I suppose that's half true. I think dogs, less so cats, actually. Cats have a bit of a sort of transformation in terms of their perception of the 19th century. They're not really kept as pets that much until about the 1850s. They are kept, but they are largely kept to control vermin. Dogs, yes, though, people definitely felt affection for them, although some of them were working dogs as well. But I guess I'd say even within that category of dogs, you kind of have gradations. So pedigree dogs, for example, dogs that were a particular breed, like a St Bernard or a poodle, people cared about them if they were owned, if they were pets. Definitely you get prosecutions for the mistreatment of pets. Usually public mistreatment, not kind of in people's homes, which was a different issue. On the other hand, though, stray dogs, mongrels that were kind of running around the street, people associate them with things like rabies. They're very worried about them. Some of them are cold, and this happens both in Britain and in its colonies. So it kind of depends a little bit on the animal that we're looking at. And I guess beyond dogs and cats, mammals tend to attract more attention, particularly kind of large, supposedly sort of sentient mammals. I mean, elephants I'm thinking of here in particular. There's an awful lot of concern for like the elephant Jumbo when he's sold to the circus owner P.T. Barnum in the States. People are very worried about him. Is he being treated cruelly? Would he get seasick when he's travelling across the Atlantic? So you get those kind of concerns. But on the other hand, other mammals, not so much. I mean, no one's very worried about vermin, so sort of rats and mice. No one's very worried about wolves, even though they're quite close to dogs. And again, people are quite happy to exterminate them, often in quite cruel ways. And the RSPCA even actually at one point advocates culling tigers in India because it says they can't be civilised, they're just killing human beings, they should be got rid of. So, attitudes are not quite where they are today on that, but it does depend a lot on species and whether it's a pet or what its category is.
What about vivisection? What were attitudes to that practice?
Generally more hostile, particularly in Britain. And this is partly because vivisection wasn't so big in Britain until sort of the middle of the 19th century. It was something that kind of notoriously happened, particularly in France, where sort of comparative anatomy is big. And therefore there's a level of sort of xenophobia in how it's described. It's a French thing, it's a continental thing. We don't do that in Britain. And this is where you start to get this narrative of, British people being kinder to animals beginning to arise. But people were really worried about vivisection. And I think there's several reasons for this. One is, well, as you suggested, it's the species of animals. So often it is dogs and cats. And people are worried that in some cases pets are being kind of taken off the street and experimented on. And there's some evidence that sometimes they are. So that's a concern. Also, the nature of what is happening is often seen as repeated cruelty. The same animal might be experimented on more than once. which is sort of likened to torture. Francis Power Cobb, who's one of the most prominent anti-vivisectionists, writes a book called The Modern Rack, kind of, again, comparing what happens to animals to what would have happened in sort of medieval torture. So that's a big concern. It's also a bit of a concern because the people doing vivisection are not your standard kind of working class bull baiters. These are kind of the elite. And people are kind of worried both that they will sort of be corrupted by what they're doing, but also this is kind of like happening behind closed doors, secretly. So people often don't know quite what is being done, but they're very worried about it. So this becomes a really big issue in the 1860s and 70s.
And when do people start to become interested in or concerned about hunting for sport as an activity and the cruelty that they might have viewed as implicit in that?
A lot later, actually. The RSPCA doesn't really do much about it. And this is because actually quite a few prominent RSPCA members, they did go hunting for sport. So Richard Martin, Thomas Fowle Buxton, two of the key kind of founders of the organisation, they go hunting. And they manage, in their minds at least, to sort of separate this from other forms of cruelty. The argument is often that this is, allegedly a quicker death, so it's less cruel. I think there's very dubious evidence for that. But yeah, because it's kind of embedded in the elite, there's not much of an attack on hunting. You start to see sort of individual things that are deemed particularly kind of unfair get a lot of bad press towards the very end of the 19th century. So, for example, one concern is something called a crated deer, which is basically where you get a deer that's almost domesticated and you kind of bring it in to be hunted in a particular arena. You want to actually kill it. You might use the same deer sort of multiple times, partly for sort of conservation reasons. But that was deemed really unfair because the animal couldn't really get away. It wasn't an even contest. Similarly, there was a big sort of pigeon shooting contest at Hurlingham in Surrey. And that was, again, deemed really unfair because people have, the most modern weapons and could just take out loads of pigeons. So you do get kind of criticism of that, but not much legislation. And the RSPCA, like I say, is fairly quiet on that. Other organisations start to form that are more vocal about hunting. The Humanitarian League is the prime one, but not the RSPCA. And this is something it gets criticised for.
Am I right in thinking it's a bit later? It's the Edwardian period, I think, which was kind of the high point of sort of game shooting when you had these massive shoots with thousands of birds shot. Was that something that people voiced any concerns about? I guess it's a high status activity, right? And so I suppose that ties back into what you were talking about before about differential attitudes between classes.
Absolutely. So there's some concern. And again, often it's because it's deemed unsporting. So I guess even within the elite, certain forms of hunting do attract criticism. So often kind of sportsmen will go, well, they might be hunting foxes in Britain, but this is increasingly a colonial thing. People are hunting sort of elephants and tigers in Africa or India. And there is a concern that they're going to kind of kill them all and there's not going to be any more to hunt. So there's kind of a conservationist concern. But it's particularly a concern that actually more middle class or lower class people are coming out and killing everything, which is going to, damage things for the elite. So there are sort of other things wrapped up in that. But I think it's less about cruelty and it's more about conservation, actually, in that period. So there are big efforts to stop, particularly kind of commercial hunting, which isn't sustainable, but not so much hunting for sport.
There's a debate, I think, that was going on about the difference between necessary and unnecessary cruelty. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I would say there was a debate going on then. Some of this is also true now. So I guess some forms of cruelty are deemed, I suppose, essential in the sense that, if you're saying you're killing an animal for meat, for example, in the Victorian period at least, that's mainly deemed essential. People had to do that. Equally, killing animals for clothing, if it was kind of essential clothing. So things like wool don't create a lot of concern, even leather, which is seen as more of a byproduct of meat. So that's sort of necessary cruelty. On the other hand, you have unnecessary cruelty, which the Victorians would probably have called wanton cruelty. So again, thinking about the meat industry, this would mean things like foie gras, which means inflicting on cruelty on an animal, in how you rear it, by, in this case, force feeding geese. It also means things like transporting live animals. So there's concern about transporting cattle, particularly live cattle, across the Atlantic. And the RSPCA publishes an article about this called The Roast Beef of Old England, which shows essentially cattle on a ship from Argentina, some of them falling into the water during a storm and sort of rolling about the deck. So there's concern about that because that's not strictly necessary. And the same for things like clothing. So there's big concern towards the end of the 19th century about essentially women who were wearing birds' feathers and sometimes kind of the bodies of whole birds on their hats. This is a craze that gets dubbed murderous millinery. That's not necessary. So there's a lot of opposition to that, and the same with sort of fur and things like seal skin. So people do make that distinction, and it can be, it can be quite fluid, right? Obviously what is necessary and what isn't is to some extent in the eye of the beholder. Obviously, a lot of this initially is focused on sort of sports. So bull and bear baiting are deemed, that's not necessary. No one needs to do that. That's just for human entertainment. So again, that attracts a lot of attention. But as we've discussed, hunting for sport, not so much. And I think it's a very questionable sort of argument that was more necessary. So people fox hunting would have said, we're hunting vermin, we're doing a good job. But there's also actually evidence that the British are importing foxes from the continent because they've run out of them. So that doesn't really hold water. But yeah, there is that distinction between necessary and unnecessary cruelty.
And bull and bear baiting specifically, that to modern eyes feels, wildly cruel, I would imagine. Certainly does to me. When does that come to an end? Is that legislated out, or is the social attitudes mean that no longer exists?
Bit of both, but primarily that is legislated out in 1835 with the Animal Cruelty Act. After about a decade of debating it, that becomes illegal. And again, that is deemed often quite cruel because it's seen as being unfair. So you get lots of sort of tracts saying how this poor bull was set upon, or this poor bear was young and didn't want to fight. So there is kind of an attitude thing going on there as well. But the legislation bans it. So after that, you can't bait any animal, bull or bear or anything else.
I'm sort of skipping around a little bit, but a question I really wanted to ask. So the campaigns that you described and the way the RSPCA sort of approached things sounds very similar to other campaigns at the time. I'm thinking of Temperance, particularly. They had their own magazines, didn't they? They got children involved in trying to vocalise the arguments. How far do all these campaigns sort of intersect and use the same methodologies?
I would say quite a lot, not least because it's often literally the same people involved in these campaigns. So, again, if we think about some of the sort of founding members, so Richard Martin, he is also concerned about Catholic emancipation in Ireland. And Thomas Fowle Buxton is a prominent abolitionist, so against slavery. William Wilberforce is not formally, but he's very much involved in this movement as well. So there is this kind of movement of personnel. And you see this later in the century as well. So often quite prominent feminists like Frances Power Cobb and Louise Lind af Hagby, they are also very prominent anti-vivisectionists because they see the things as actually interlinked, both women and animals potentially being abused. And I think they do sort of learn from one another in terms of, propaganda, in terms of, how you deal with these issues. I guess, the most direct connection actually is probably between the RSPCA and the NSPCC, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which is really an offshoot of the RSPCA actually, and it's founded in 1889, and its co-founder is a lady called Angela Burdett Coutts, who had been in charge of the kind of ladies' committee at the RSPCA. So this is, the same concerns really about your treatment of animals, treatment of children. And obviously it's slightly worrying that the movement to protect children comes later than animals. But this was partly about, again, this reluctance to interfere with people's lives, to go into people's homes and to sort of observe them. So yeah, there are a lot of connections, I think, both in how they tackle cruelty, but also like what they're worried about.
What about the Vegetarian Society? Presumably their aims would have aligned quite closely with the RSPCA.
Yes and no. So yes, this is a society that emerges in the 1840s, and it's encouraging people obviously not to eat animals. It's less about sort of dairy; it's mostly meat at this point. The RSPCA, though, actually doesn't. It was against vegetarianism, but it actually never formally advocates that. It's much more about kind of mitigating cruelty. So it does advocate, good treatment of cattle, humane forms of slaughter, humane forms of transportation, but it actually never goes there with vegetarianism. But you do find other groups, and again, the most notable is this group called the Humanitarian League, which emerges in the late 19th century under a guy called Henry Salt. And this is basically a more radical version of the RSPCA, and they do call for vegetarianism, not just kinder forms of slaughter. They also call for things like female suffrage and the abolition of the death penalty. So they're more kind of out there. But yeah, the RSPCA are not vegetarians. Actually, they would probably have seen meat as necessary, I guess, and certainly in the Victorian period.
I said I'd ask you a little bit about the difference between animal cruelty, animal rights, and animal conservation. I guess nowadays it's fairly easy to establish what those different terms mean. When did they become sort of established as differential matters?
I think probably towards the end of the 19th century, when both of those movements sort of start to emerge. So the RSPCA and the early legislation, I would say, is as animal welfare. So this is really, again, mitigating cruelty, alleviating it, but not necessarily saying you can't eat animals, but you just shouldn't keep them in a certain way. Animal rights, again, I would say that's more the kind of thing that Humanitarian League are driving towards. They perhaps wouldn't have used that term, but this is more about animals having certain kind of fundamental rights that I guess usually we'd accord to humans. So that might be like a right to liberty, hence no zoos, no factory farming. It might be a right to life, so, no killing anything. And it might be a right to sort of freedom from torture, which would mean no animal experimentation. So, again, they don't use those terms precisely, but you're starting to see that emerge, I think, with movements like that, which I would say are very much minority movements at the time. You also then start to see the conservationist movement emerging towards the end of the 19th century. And in many ways, this is kind of separate, although clearly often the two aims would align. So there's concern particularly about commercial hunting of certain species. So things like fur seals are dying out because people are wearing sealskin jackets, elephants, which are being hunted for their ivory. Many other species, people are kind of starting to realise, these things are disappearing. So you do get a movement to, again, not always to ban hunting, but to regulate it, to sort of limit the importation of certain animal products, particularly sort of birds' feathers, which becomes a very prominent campaign. Like I said, so often these things would align, right? So, if you're an animal protectionist and animal welfarist, you don't like killing seals, but you are probably particularly worried about the cruelty involved in that. And then these sort of grisly stories of seals being skinned alive, which is all rather nasty. On the other hand, if you're a conservationist, you don't necessarily care so much about the suffering of the individual, or you might, but you're really worried about the survival of the species. So their concern is, if we don't regulate this, there won't be any seals left. But they were okay with killing them if there were sufficient numbers. And that's a distinction that I think you get actually increasingly in more modern contexts. What do we do with invasive species, for instance? What do we do about things like trophy hunting? How do we balance those kind of the individual rights of one animal not to suffer versus damage to ecosystems and other things? So, which I think there isn't a really clear answer to.
One last thing. This is a really interesting topic, and as we started the conversation it aligns with lots of other things that were happening in the Victorian period. What does it tell us generally? Does it help you to fully understand the period? Is it a nice way into Victorian Britain?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, as someone who, like I say, is an animal lover and identifies myself in that way, I am really interested in what people thought about animals in lots of different periods, really, and what that can tell us about their culture, their belief systems. And I suppose I feel mixed looking at it. So on the one hand, you look back and you see some stuff that seems really horrific, I suppose. And it's nice that, we've improved and we don't do those things. But I've often actually been more struck by, again, reading comments by people who actually do seem to, share my concerns and views. They go to a zoo and describe, there was a sad bear in a cage and I felt really bad about it. And in a way, I don't know, it can seem quite modern, some of these concerns. So it's not like we have solved all these problems now. So I wouldn't want to kind of push this narrative of, we're much kinder to animals now than we used to be. We don't do some stuff, like you wouldn't see a bear being baited in the street, but we do some other stuff, factory farming, experimentation that in many ways is worse. So I don't know. I think it gets a feel for the period, and you can certainly see some positives, the reformers. Obviously, we do need to be very, very aware of how much often this is connected with, like I say, these ideas of a broader civilising drive. Some of this is really problematic when it's done in a colonial setting. Some of it tends to pick on foreigners, on lower class people. So there's a lot of not great stuff. But I do think at the heart of it, there are people who did genuinely care about animals, which I can certainly identify with.